Hello, everybody. Доброе утро, добрый день или добрый вечер, когда бы вы ни подключились к нашей программе. I have been invited to speak to you about my career, my scholarly career of a linguist. But there is one small correction to this invitation. I'm going to speak about my career as a philologist rather than a linguist, because philology includes both language and literature, and I have been active in both fields and will not limit myself to linguistics only. The reason why I was invited to speak to you on my career, which is quite an honor, really, is that not too long ago, several months ago, the University of Minnesota Press published my book about the history of English idioms. People are always interested in idioms, and the book has been quite successful so far because we don't know what its future will be, but so far it has been quite successful. Many people praised it and sold it and reviewed it, and that is why I ended up in your program. So here's a story of my life in philology rather than in linguistics. I got both my degrees, which are in Russian candidate, of course I'll give the English equivalent, candidate of philological sciences and doctor of philological sciences in Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg, because I was born in Leningrad and had all my education in Leningrad too. There I studied at an institute which was called, I'll give the Russian name, Герценовский педагогический институт. That is a pedagogical institute, a Herzen Pedagogical Institute, which is now a university. And there I studied English because they were using the Russian word rather than the English-American word. There were several faculties there. The American word faculty means a member of the faculty, and faculty means a huge group of departments, as in Europe, in Germany, for example. So I was a student in the English department, where I had at least one truly excellent teacher, and was interested in literature more than in linguistics. But it so happened that the only professor who could direct my studies there was a linguistics professor. So I wrote my two first papers about linguistics. Then I worked for 3 years as a teacher in a suburban school. I don't really mean suburban, away from Leningrad, about 100 miles away from Leningrad, a boarding school there, and taught English there. And then returned and became a graduate student also in Leningrad. There it was my good luck to have a wonderful advisor, the great Professor Stephen Kamensky. And my first dissertation for the first degree candidate of philological sciences was about the history of the English language. And it was about sounds, about vowels. So I began to study what is technically known as historical phonology. Whether you call it phonology or phonetics doesn't really matter at this moment, because it's phonetics. And phonology is simply a technical term for it. So I wrote my dissertation about the history of English sounds. And then there was an opportunity, thanks to Stephen Kamensky, of course, to become a member of the Academy of Sciences and to switch to the Scandinavian area and Scandinavian department. There I was a colleague in a special, the Russian word was sector, in the sector for the study of the Indo-European languages. But my focus now, from that time on, was on the Scandinavian languages. And my second dissertation was devoted to Icelandic, again, phonetics. In 1975, I emigrated to the United States, and that was a rather decent time for specialists like me. Today, it would have been practically impossible to find a job. But at that time, the philologists were not in demand, but at least they were needed from time to time. And I got a job, which was a wonderful thing for someone using the American expression just off the boat, and became a professor at the University of Minnesota, where I have worked, that is, taught, ever since. for many decades, or almost for half a century. And there, that is why one of the paradoxes of one's life, first it was from English to Scandinavian, now it was from Scandinavian to all Germanic, and especially to German, because I had a joint appointment in the German department and the Scandinavian department, 2/3 in German. So I began to teach German, which at that time I knew worse than English, but then later I made a heroic effort to learn German to such a degree that I could speak it fluently, lecture in it, and teach it. Though I never taught modern German, that is, how to speak German, how to read German, I taught philological courses, Old High German, Middle High German, and then, of course, Old Icelandic, and even such exotic things as Middle Dutch and Old Frisian. That is everything Germanic, because Germanic is a special cover term for all the related languages of this group. And that is what I have been doing for almost half a century, as I said. And first it was phonetics and phonology, but one day it sounds almost like a joke or like a tale from a fairy tale. Naturally, etymology, which projected me into some sort of local fame. You understand that a famous linguist or a famous philologist is not the same thing as a famous singer, or not a famous singer or a famous rock singer, rocker. If one is known only in the narrow circle of specialists. I taught etymology because that was part of my courses, especially in connection with Gothic. Gothic is the oldest Germanic language, which was recorded in the 4th century. And when one studies Gothic, which is a dead language, of course, today, when one studies Gothic, one teaches the early history of all the Germanic languages. So etymology came to the foreground, at least to a certain extent. But one day, and I'm coming to my fairy tale story, I was reading something. I think it was some book on German dialects, and found a word which seemed to me interesting from an etymological point of view. But the main impulse was the Scandinavian female name Heidrun, which is Heidrun in German. And I thought, is it possible that the word Heidrun is connected to the English word heifer? Now, if you don't know the word heifer, don't feel ashamed. It's a rather rare word, Heifer, but the middle is not pronounced the way it is spelled, so heifer. Heifer is a young cow. And I thought, is heifer related to Heidrun? So I went to an etymological dictionary. I had 2 etymological dictionaries at home at that time, and looked up the origin of the word heifer, and found an astounding answer. Heifer, origin unknown. Then I looked up the origin of the word Heidrun, because there I also have an etymological dictionary of Old Scandinavian, or rather Old Norse, as it is called. And it turned out that the origin was at least disputed, not exactly unknown, but unclear. It surprised me very much that the word heifer, which had existed since the days of Old English, had no etymology. I spoke to my friend and colleague in the English department, and he asked me, and do you know such and such a dictionary? What is said there? I said, I've never heard about such a dictionary. I was quite sure that I had known everything about etymological dictionaries. It was very, very wrong. So, and he had one of the editions of that dictionary, and I looked up the word there, and there was quite a different answer. There was some etymology. So I thought, how strange. Here is one dictionary which says that the origin is such and such, and another dictionary says that the origin is unknown. So I began to investigate, and I discovered that there was an ocean of etymological dictionaries. I had naively thought that there were 2 or 3 sources to consult. Many, many more. And every dictionary said something different, gave a different story. I was confused, or as my colleague in the classics department used to say, I was confused. Well, confused or confused, I thought, so what is the etymology? And it occurred to me that there is no good etymological dictionary of English. They are professional, but not good. I began to study the etymology of the word heifer, and it turned out that there was quite a literature on this word, a lot to read. And I even wrote my own etymology, which, as I today think, is half correct. Now I have a better idea. So I was surprised. There are such good dictionaries, etymological dictionaries of Greek and Latin, and practically every Slavic language, including Russian, where not only curt answers are given, such and such origin or origin unknown, or whatever it may be, and they give the literature that is connected with the word. You can go on reading after you have closed the dictionary. You can do even more than that. You can compare conflicting ideas. So I decided that a good etymological dictionary had to be produced. And I embarked on this utopian project. I decided that we should collect all the literature on most English words, which at least need some sort of discussion, and produce a dictionary like the one we have for French, for Dutch, for Russian, for Greek, and Latin. And that was the beginning of my etymological career. Phonology or phonetics didn't go away, but it remained in the background, and that's why it still remains. I still write something on phonology. But if I'm at all known, and let me repeat again, being known in linguistics is nothing. That doesn't mean that cheering crowds in the street will recognize me. They sometimes recognize me after I'm invited to speak to the public radio, or where there's a review in a newspaper. 2 days later, they stop recognizing me. So fame is a very relative concept in my area. So if I am at all known, I'm known for etymology. Phonology is a much more obscure subject of study. So I'm mainly known as an etymologist, especially after I wrote a detailed etymology of the ignominious F word, which I won't dare to pronounce in full. And everybody asked me again for several days, are you the guy who wrote the etymology of the F word? And I smiled benignantly and said, yes, I'm the man. And they would say, good for you, and forget me. So I began to work on collecting that enormous, huge bibliography of everything written on every word. I have half an hour at my disposal. It would take me much more time to tell you everything about it. But believe it or not, I have collected that literature. I doesn't mean that I did it alone. There were about 40 volunteers who looked through journals and periodicals, popular periodicals in English, because most of them couldn't read any other language, only English. But German, Scandinavian, and especially Slavic, all those journals I screened myself, and ended up with thousands and thousands of forgotten articles, and not always forgotten, but all kinds of articles about the origin of words. It turned out that a lot had been written about the origin of words and lost, because you think when one is young, I say when you think, but I'm speaking about myself, when you publish an article, you think, oh, tomorrow the whole world will read it. Forget about it, especially if there is a mistake, a typo, you are in despair. Oh, tomorrow the whole world will notice the typo and will despise you. You may write whatever you want. Most people will never notice you. And that is what happens even to good articles published in famous journals, famous, of course, in their area. That is, someone explained the origin, let us say the word heifer, but that's an imaginary example, in 1923. And it was noticed in 1924 and forgotten in 1925. Of course, there are bibliographies, but those bibliographies are, as I now know, most incomplete. One also had to look through so-called popular periodicals where people wrote, non-professional people, wrote letters asking about the origin of some words, and then received answers. That is how we ended up with more than 20,000 notes, letters, comments, articles, and of course books were there, but books were not screened for that purpose, because books are much easier to find. When I have a book called English Etymology, you cannot miss it. But when I have an article published in a small journal 100 years ago, and in a language which most people don't read, let us suppose in Polish, you cannot expect that the world will notice it. And when we collected this bibliography, it came out close to 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and I'm extremely proud of this work. Now, anyone who wants to know what has been written about any English word, any, of course, is an exaggeration, but most English words that interest people along such lines, including slang and so on, they can look it up and find the journal. All the articles, that is the material itself, everything, all the folders stand in my office at the university. What will happen to those folders after me? I'm not quite sure. We'll try to digitalize them and perhaps give them as a present to the Oxford English Dictionary or to someone else. It's hard to tell. In any case, all those folders are there. Every time when I want to write the origin, the etymology, or about the etymology of a word, I go to my computer, to my database, as it is called, and look it up. For example, today I've been working on the word flaunt, F-L-A-U-N-T, and found a few articles about it. On the other hand, about 6 or 7 years ago, I decided to write an article about the English word God, and found 220 articles about the word God. It doesn't mean that all those articles are about the word God, and that is what is so hard about my work. These are articles in which the word God is mentioned from an etymological point of view. You have to screen this article, to look through the whole text, write the word God in the margin for your assistant, and then it will end up in my database. And sometimes articles, which is very common, have maddening, irritating titles. For example, some etymological notes or 3 German words. You never know whether something of any interest will turn up there. In any case, the bibliography is there. The bibliography was quite a success. A success, of course, in my narrow circle. Let me rub it in all the time. And I was asked by Oxford University Press to write a book on word origins. And this book was a success, moderately so, but I think more than 20,000 copies or something like around this number, now probably more because there have been 2 editions, a hardcover and a paperback, have been sold. And I constantly see references to it. And another book with the title Origin Uncertain will appear also published by Oxford next year, probably next spring. So there are 2 semi, or as Americans say, semi-popular books. You can read them without any expertise in linguistics, in phonology, in etymology, in anything. That is really for the public. Now, I keep working on it, and at the time, approximately the same time as the bibliography, with the collaboration of my good friend, the one who once showed me a dictionary with the word heifer, about which I had known nothing, or which I had been blissfully unaware. With his technical help, we produced an introduction called An Analytic Dictionary of English Etymology. And It contains many words, but of course not all the words. And it is very clear that I'm too old to produce a full-scale dictionary that I once had a dream of producing. But if someone picks up where I leave off, the bibliography is there, the database is there. So go on and study the words. So that's where we were. Now, to remind you, the immediate reason for my invitation to a program was that about half a year ago, about 6 months ago, the University of Minnesota Press published a book about idioms. You had it as a poster. I can show it if you want to you. That's the book, which you have already seen. I have it near me in case there is a question which I won't be able to answer without consulting my own book. It's called Take My Word for It, and it's a dictionary of English idioms on the history of English idioms. It was not part of my initial plan to write about idioms. But since while reading or screening those countless journals, we ran also into some articles about idioms, I naturally knew that there was such a problem. Also, from time to time, we run into English idioms whose main problem, from an etymological point of view, or simply from the point of view of a native speaker, is that there are words there which nobody knows. They're never used outside those idioms. For example, there is an idiom to bear the brunt of something. That is to bear, to meet an attack and be the first to confront the attackers. What is brunt? No one really knows. The word exists in etymological dictionaries, but the word is a ghost because it exists only in this idiom. Or you have an idiom, English has an idiom, to be left or to leave someone in the lurch, that is in a difficult, unpleasant situation. Where is that lurch which exists somewhere? Is it some sort of swamp? Or what is it? The word is never used outside this idiom. Both idioms that I have just cited, that is to leave someone in the lurch and to bear the brunt, both are very well known. That is, they're common idioms, but the etymology is the problem. So when I realized, it was I think about some 10 years ago, that I would probably never have enough time to finish the dictionary. And I will never have enough time because I've never had enough money for hiring professional assistants. You can't do this work alone. There should be a team. And then I realized that when I'm repeating what I have just said, that I surely would not be able, I'm saying would because I'm now an American speaker, and if you are British speakers, then I should. I would not be able to finish my dictionary. I decided that I could write a dictionary of, etymological dictionary of idioms, at least, as consolation. And we again started from scratch. That is, again, I had many assistants. I must say, I've just said that I had no money for assistants. All my assistants, with very few students, called in America undergraduates, were volunteers. You cannot imagine how many people there are in the world who love words. All kinds of people. They also worked for my big work for the bibliography, would swarm to me and saying, I love words. And what are you doing? I'm a janitor. I do this. I do that. All kinds of things. And many of them would say smilingly, I hate my job, but I love words. So they will go to the library and screen journals. Today, many things can be done online. Almost everything can be done online. But at that time, there were almost no computers and definitely nothing to read online. So we began to look through the same journals or the same periodicals and collected a very good database connected with the origin of idioms. Now, what is an idiom? Everything that is more than two words and needs an explanation is an idiom. Thank you is an idiom, and it doesn't need an explanation because we know what it means. But when you bear the brunt, and not only, or when anything, I can open my dictionary at random, and you find a page with the idiom hue and cry, or a funny idiom, I am a Dutchman. What does it mean? Who began to say hue and cry? And who began to say I am a Dutchman? And what does that mean? So we collected a good database of such idioms, not simply all the idioms in the world, but those idioms about which something has been written. That is, they are written not online. For example, there are idioms about which a lot has been written online today. You can look up practically everything, the origin of practically everything about the origin of anything online. Sometimes trivial, sometimes in Wikipedia, a very good explanation, but there is no database like the one we have collected. It's a small book, a bit more than 1,000 idioms. But if you include proverbs, which I didn't include, there are tens of thousands of idioms in English and in every other language. Some of them have never been explained, since probably all of you who are listening to me are Russian speakers. You may know that for years I've been trying to find out the origin of the idiom съесть собаку на чем-то, which translated into English, if someone doesn't understand Russian, is to eat a dog about something, which means to learn everything about it and to learn everything very well. Why does someone have to eat a dog? And why just a dog? Mind you, it's not a hot dog, it's just a real dog. There are several explanations which I found quite unconvincing. There are such idioms in my dictionary too. So that is how the dictionary appeared, which was a doable thing. It still took 10 years, and it is still the result of hard work. And I have to thank many people who looked through so many sources. I have written everything myself. And today, and my university, which has published the bibliography and which has published the introduction to the dictionary, also published this book. The first two books are certainly not popular, but they sold very well. Very well, of course, for such books. That is, they are not bestsellers, but they sold very well to pay for themselves. And every major university has these books. And the book which is the impetus for my talk and for this invitation is also selling very well. Whether it is selling like hotcakes, that is with everyone clamoring for another copy, I don't know. But only half a year has passed and things are going well. So that is what I wanted to tell you about my career of philologist. I didn't mention the fact, and I have about a minute or half a minute left because I was asked to speak for half an hour, that I have studied a lot of literature, poetic translation, and translated great Russian poets into English, Lermontov, Tютчев, and Boratinsky, and translated all Shakespeare's sonnets into Russian, and into Russian, yes, of course, into Russian. And this is part of my philological work, of my life of a linguist, because these things always come together. The more you study one thing, the better you understand something else. Etymology helped me very well while translating 19th century Russian poetry and while translating Shakespeare into Russian. And then there is literary criticism, which has nothing to do with my work of a linguist, but a lot to do with my life in philology in general. I bowed little to look at my watch, though I have, of course, something on my screen which says 12:30. So I've done many things in many areas, and that is a very beautiful thing that I was not sitting within a very narrow cell with just one project. So that's the end of my presentation, and thank you for listening. And I was told that there will be questions. And I have one question here so far, and I'll be very happy to answer, especially since you grew up in the USSR. And how did the interest evolve into Scandinavian and all Germanic really languages? The Scandinavian languages, German and other languages, were studied very well in the Soviet Union. And my great teacher, Mikhail Ivanovich Sibrin-Kamensky, was the man who made Scandinavian studies famous among Soviet philologists. And it was a piece of tremendous good luck that I was his advisee. German was also in very good shape with Zermunsky and Admoni and others who were really world famous in their philological world as great specialists in German linguistics. So there was nothing exotic about it. But my Scandinavian job happened by chance, and I will say only a few words about it. Soon after Stalin's death, Khrushchev began to travel abroad, which was quite a novelty. And he went to Sweden, and he liked Sweden very much. And he naively believed that the high level of life in Sweden was something very special, especially because it's a welfare state that is socialist, using the Russian term for it. And he was wondering why the Soviet Union was socialist and so miserably poor, and Sweden, which was capitalist and socialist, was so fabulously rich. So being a rather enthusiastic but ignorant person, he returned to the Soviet Union and said, there is something that is called Scandinavian experience, and we have to study it, and gave a command that all the institutes of the Academy of Sciences should study something that he, in his ignorance, called Scandinavian experience. That meant that every institute had to study how its area is being developed or has been developed in Scandinavia. Among other things, linguistics, which is absolutely nothing to do with the life of common people or anyone in Scandinavia. In any case, my teacher, Stephen Kamensky, was invited to head such a group. And he invited me to be, I'll use the Russian term, младший научный сотрудник. That is a junior assistant at the Academy of Sciences. That's when I stopped teaching. Before that, I taught at the Polytechnic Institute in Leningrad for 3 years and became a specialist in Scandinavian linguistics. By that time, I had known decently only Old Icelandic. And I said to Stephen Kamensky, he liked my dissertation very much, and apparently liked me very much. Otherwise, he would not have invited me. He said, I said, how am I going to do it? I know so little about Scandinavian. He pooh-poohed my question and said, oh, that's nothing. I also came to Scandinavian linguistics from English, and Scandinavian linguistics is very provincial. They need someone with a much broader background. And as to the Scandinavian languages, you will learn them. And that's what I eventually did. So that is how I ended up in Scandinavian philology. And that is it. And I think that I have another question, which I'll read out loud, though you probably can see it too. English idioms, cultural aspect and historical origins. If so, could you share some fascinating examples? Almost every example is fascinating because idioms are very tricky things. They reflect culture in a very concrete way. Well, for example, there are you remember I read something called I'm a Dutchman. There are very many idioms in English with the word Dutch, and they're always negative. For example, there is Dutch courage, which means cowardice. Everything that has the word Dutch in it is always negative, because these idioms go back to the time of rivalry between the British Navy and the Dutch Navy. That is British-Dutch wars. So you wonder why being Dutch is so bad. Well, that's history, of course. But then you look at something, you want some fascinating example. Let me give you probably the example which is the most fascinating of all. There is an idiom which is very little known today, but it exists. Sleeveless, this type of sleeve, so with the suffix less, without a sleeve. Sleeveless errand, E-R-R-A-N-D, sleeveless errand, which means a wrong errand, or a bad errand rather, an unsuccessful errand. Why is it such? And the word sleeveless existed even in Chaucer's time. I investigated it, and the reason why I now think I know the origin of this is that I taught practically everything in Germanic philology, including one of my most popular courses, Middle High German literature. And Middle High German literature, Tristan, Parzifal, Nibelungen, they are all about knights, K-N-I-G-H-T, about chivalric, the British term is chivalric experience. And there I suddenly ran into a very interesting phenomenon. And that's, of course, how you become a good etymologist. If you are not limited or confined, rather, to some narrow area, this word, that word, another word, a third, a fourth word. I found a lot about knights' sleeves and how important they were, and in general about a lot about medieval sleeves. And it turned out that a sleeveless errand is most probably an errand which has no sleeve, that is, no chance of success. It's a very long story, and I'll make it short because otherwise I will never stop. Also, it teaches you a lesson. If you want to be a philologist, you have to be a kind of 19th century philologist, where linguistics and literature are one area. We very often have linguists today who have never read a single novel. We have philologists, we have literary scholars who don't know what the word phoneme means. This is a blind alley. This is something that holds no promise whatsoever. My good luck was that I was surrounded by great philologists. For 10 years, I worked at the Institute of Linguistics in Leningrad, then in the Indo-European sector, surrounded by first-rate philologists in classics, in Germanic, in Slavic, everywhere. There were so many people whom I could imitate and look up to. Etymology and philology, unless it is a very broad field, is a waste of time. Who are you? I have another question which has nothing to do with etymology, but that's perfectly all right. You have probably all read Oscar Wilde, and my favorite British writer. And one of the characters says in Oscar Wilde, questions are never indiscreet, answers sometimes are. But here is a question which is certainly not indiscreet. Who are your favorite modern writers? This is a very hard question because I mentioned in passing that I do a lot of literary criticism, and I read hundreds, thousands of pages. Modern fiction that I read is something that I don't like at all. So I really cannot say that I have a favorite modern writer. If I begin with my favorite writers, I will give you a very uninspiring list because that's not what you expect. Beginning with Dickens and Thackeray, and Dickens is my great favorite. Then you go on to Jack London and Mark Twain, again, certainly not modern authors. Then Huxley, whom I like very much and have read and reread him many times. And that is about it as far as modern writers are concerned. I certainly have forgotten someone because one needs time to concentrate on it. But definitely the authors who have written novels or fiction in general, short stories between, let us say, 1970 and today, none is good. There is one excellent Russian writer who lives in Germany with a German name because he is of German origin. That's why he is there. Whose name is Vladimir Stelle, an excellent writer and an excellent poet. I know how very unsatisfactory my answer is, but that's because I haven't read anything, recently, that impressed me. Question: in your opinion, why are idioms an integral part of language? Idioms have existed forever, and especially if you include formulas. For example, good morning, good afternoon, and what is with contempt called buzzwords. That is, thank you very much. What's the answer? Same to you. It's a buzzword, of course. But what else can you say? You cannot express everything with the help of just one word. You need groups of words. So thank you, or thank you very much, or good afternoon, or see you again, or many happy returns of the day, or as Americans say, happy birthday to you. There is a song to this effect. You need many words. Also, if you have a broad definition of idioms, then words like give up is an idiom. You can very well know what give means, and you certainly know what up means, but that doesn't help you at all if you don't know what give up means. And when you look up a word, why do you look it up when very often you really look it down? So idioms are inevitable. One thing that is interesting is that such trivial combinations existed even in the oldest languages. I don't mean Latin and Greek. Those were full of idioms. I mean the Germanic languages. But other than that, when you begin to study idioms, you find that idioms, which very often have a metaphorical meaning, that is, I'm a Dutchman. It doesn't mean that I'm a Dutchman. It's a metaphor. It must be interpreted, translated into something sensible. You need a whole context to explain it. All the idioms are post-Renaissance phenomena. That is, while reading Beowulf, which is an Old English poem, or the Nibelungenlied, which is a Middle High German poem, if you know all the words and know the language, you are not in trouble. But when you read modern Russian or modern English and run into some nonsense like "Съесть собаку на чем-то" or "I'm a Dutchman," you don't understand what it's all about. All these sayings are late because metaphors appeared after the Renaissance. That is one of the products of the new age. They were not part of the medieval mentality, which is quite a subject. The more the older the language, the more transparent it is from an idiomatic point of view. But our languages are chock full of metaphors, thousands of them. Proverbs have always existed. There is a book of Proverbs in the Bible. Greeks and Romans had all kinds of familiar quotations. But I mean those untranslatable idioms which need an explanation. They're a product of our developed mentality, like the sense of humor and many other things. I have, I think, a question which is not numbered, but it's definitely a new question. You offer to individuals, what is your offer probably? Seeking to understand and use idiomatic expressions effectively. Unfortunately, no. You have to learn them one after another. I may tell you, since you're all listening to me in Russian, you may or may not know that a very successful study of idioms began in the Soviet Union. The real beginning is in France, but it was picked up at the beginning of the 20th century. But it was picked up in the 50s by Soviet scholars. And since my rapid English, you must be very good at it, you probably know that there are dictionaries of English idioms. I remember the success, the author of the dictionary is Kunin. I remember the tremendous success of the first edition. It is a rather mixed bag. All kinds of things are called idioms there. And you find we sold those dictionaries. The dictionaries sold like nothing at all. There were lines in front of the bookstore in order to buy this book. There is now a second edition, probably a third, but I know only a second. And learning idioms the way we learn words, that is, let us learn 10 words today. That's possible if after 10 days you have 100 words and you still remember them, possible. But learning idioms like that is probably a hopeless endeavor. You have to come across an idiom, and if you learn it, you have to find out whether you want it, whether you need it. You shouldn't overdo it. It's always a bit funny when someone uses idioms in every sentence, which produces only a humorous effect. So one by one, bilingualism and multilingualism affect the human brain and cognitive processes. Hard to tell. There is a book in Russian which was published 2 years ago, which is called Отец и сын, Father and Son. When my son was born, I decided to try an experiment and began to speak English to him. And by the age of 4, actually by the age of 3, he was totally bilingual. My relatives and everybody used to tell me that the book is called Отец и сын. And I kept a journal of my son's development for many years. And this book sums up my experience, or rather his experience, or our mutual experience, not only about language, but about everything, schooling, sports, everything, for the first 17 years. And during the first 3 years, everybody frightened me, kept frightening me, saying, "Oh, you are ruining your child. He will never speak Russian well, and he will never speak English well because he's bilingual." As far as I know, and now I have read a lot of this literature, no, it's not dangerous. Whether it affects one's cognitive abilities, this I, of course, cannot tell you because I'm not a psychologist. Some people say that bilingual people have some advantage along these lines. Probably. I know that my son was an absolutely fluent speaking of English by the age of 4, though he didn't know children's slang, and his English was too grown-up English, so to speak, my English, which he relearned when he came to America. And I made a heroic effort that he would not forget Russian. And he speaks Russian as well as I do and writes Russian, but that's the result of my constant and cruel perseverance. We're on very good terms, incidentally. That is, he likes his experience. And another question is whether there is anyone who is perfectly bilingual. Probably not. One's native language is probably something which is deep in one's brain. Nabokov once said that he had to exchange his wonderful, pliable Russian for second-rate English. Nabokov's English is second-rate. Yes, everything is second-rate in comparison to your native language. The feeling of absolute freedom is something that you can probably never achieve in a second language. That is the result of my experience. were interested in exploring idiomatic expression as a focal point for their studies. I don't think that I have the beginning of the questions. Are interested is the beginning. Are you interested idiomatic as a focal for their studies? I do not quite know what is meant, but I can only say that very many people study idioms. And in Russia, you have an excellent French-Russian dictionary of idioms, a much worse German dictionary of idioms, and Kunin's dictionary. And now there is even a branch of linguistic scholarship, idiomatics, or phraseology. There is even a European society for the study of phraseology. Like that in the United States, but I'm sure there will be an American branch one day. So there are many people who study idioms, mainly collecting them, writing dictionaries, but also explaining their origins, which is not such a very prominent subject. Most people are lexicographers. A lexicographer is someone who deals with dictionaries, and lexicographers who put together such manuals as dictionaries. Incidentally, there are many dictionaries of English idioms. I'm by far not the first, and very few of them are really good. But the latest is quite nice, and probably the best, which was written about 10 years ago or 15 years ago. I can look it up, but the name, if someone is interested, I'll give you the name. So that is not a nook which no one can look into. It's not a very noticeable area of linguistic study, but it is fine. That is, many people study it, and amazingly many people are interested in it. That's why my dictionary is selling so very well. We bought this dictionary as students at the time, as teachers, because we were students of English, and our means, our possibility of getting English books was so limited. Our possibilities didn't exist really. We read only what was published in the Soviet Union. But everyone is interested in idioms who studies languages. So that is a branch of studies which has some future. What is the most rewarding project you have worked on? It depends on how you define rewarding. Every project in my life was rewarding because every major project, because I was never interested in rehashing trivialities. I was interested in producing new solutions or something new. For example, I wrote a book which was my doctoral dissertation, but broader than that, and which was not published in the Soviet Union, but published in the United States, with the forbidding title Germanic Accentology, the Scandinavian languages. And this was the most interesting problem of finding out. I was by far not the first to do it, not even the 100th to do it. The origin of the strange intonation in Swedish when you speak like that, and then you immediately recognize a Swede, or in Danish with studs when you sort of cough in the middle of the word. The origin of these accents is unknown. That is, there are very good hypotheses, including mine. So when I found out the truth, my truth, it doesn't mean that it's everybody's truth, but when I found a solution, it was a very rewarding project. I think every project which culminates in a solution is an ideal, rewarding project. And etymology is even more obvious from this point of view, because when you study a word and find out where the word came from, and you say to yourself, no one knew this answer, though it was so obvious. In general, good answers are always obvious. my experience in etymology is that the more complicated an answer, the greater chance that it is wrong. Usually, the way to the truth is long and hard and devious, but the answer is usually almost self-evident. So you find out the answer and say, but why didn't we think about it? Of course. And then that's the greatest reward. So yes, it's rewarding because it has a culmination. What makes your book stand out from other works? Which one? The dictionary of idioms, probably, because the question didn't specify the book. It is there is one feature in this dictionary. It cites all the sources. That is, instead of saying, for example, sleeveless errand, what it means, which also is fine, I quote and cite all the sources. That is, how did I find the answer? And you want to pick up where I have left off, then read my sources, and you can probably be able to come to a better answer. No dictionary of idioms, and that is also the curse of English etymological dictionaries. No dictionary gives you sources. So if you want to pick up where the author has left off, you cannot, which is not the case with etymological dictionaries of other languages, which I have mentioned, French, Dutch, Scandinavian, Gothic, and so on. So it's the wealth of sources that makes the book look like something unique. And that was now final. What's your advice to Russian teachers in English today? I think I need a special 1-hour session to answer this question. Since I have about 2 minutes, I'll say this. The way I don't know how Russian is taught, how English is taught in Russia today. I knew how it was taught. Our teachers were splendid, some of them, many of them, but they had a very limited background. That is, they learned English from other Russian speakers who knew English. I was the 3rd generation of students of English without any exposure to native English, that is, to British or American English. So there is, of course, no general advice, but rather a warning. It's now very easy to listen to Americans and to Britishers who speak their own English. Don't imitate unthinkingly. Don't pick up slang because you are sure to misuse it. Speak the best, the most cultured English you can. All the same, you will go on you will unfortunately keep making mistakes. It takes years to weed your English of mistakes. I know it from my bitter experience. I thought that my English was near perfect. What an illusion. Well, do what you can and combine study and culture, and that will be okay. It's written on my screen that is the last question. If that is indeed the last question, then thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you very much for asking me such provocative questions. It's always a great pleasure to know that you are not in a desert or in the wilderness and that your voice is heard. All the best to you, and study English and keep your interest in scholarship. And once again, thank you very much. I wonder whether I have to do something that we ask our students to do. Students are always asked to write papers with an introduction, the main part, and the conclusion. And the conclusion is usually trivial. The title may be, let us say, the study of idioms today. That's an imaginary example. And the conclusion is, in this paper, I have presented how idioms are studied. That's trivial and useless. But I think that some wrapping up is a useful thing. My life in philology, if there is a lesson or a message, it's one. The broader one's background, the better your philological experience. Do not separate linguistics from literature. Study both. Study also history. Don't think that here is someone who studies the German literature of the 15th century or the 13th century, and it's not interesting to you. Everything is interesting. And associations come from unexpected areas. And that's the reward for knowledge. You are not in your nut, sitting there and not seeing the world. The broader your outlook, the greater the chance that your unexpected associations will help you in your scholarly work and, of course, in your study of languages. Thank you again.